Well, does anyone want to? We have a wee one today. Is there a volunteer to take the wee one down? All right. Shelly, if you go through the center, you'll probably show up on camera. So wait. Oh. Awesome. All right. We'll wait patiently, lovingly, cordially, immaculately, less patiently. All right. 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 13. Today's I told Addie as we were texting this week about the songs, starting in chapter 10, we start getting into some pretty heavy theology. And so I'm excited. Hope you're excited. And Paul's got some tricky things he needs to talk about with this church. And so we're going to talk about some heavy things. We've already talked about heavy things. They will get heavier. But as we begin this, maybe I would ask, do any of you guys know a Christian who it seems like when they started their Christian walk, things were going very strong and they seemed to be a very powerful Christian. But then over time, maybe that passion faded and they were once known for serving or praying or even leading. But somewhere along the way, as Paul would say in the Timothys, they've drifted away. And it seems like now they've maybe walked away from their faith in the Lord. Paul tells us that those who experience God's power and his blessing are not immune to spiritual failure. And he points back specifically to Israel as the example. And he says, I want to talk to you about some warnings. Let's look at my people's background. And these are people that witnessed the most powerful things in human history that any people have ever seen. And yet they continue to chase after idols and they continue to rebel against God. And the reality is they were judged for it. And Paul will talk about that at length here. And as I would remind you, as we read through Paul's letters, his letters are not written to non-Christians. They're not written to unsaved people. These letters are written to the church, God's people. And Paul wants to warn us. But more than just warn us, at the end of this passage, we're going to see that Paul gives us 4 huge encouragements that we don't have to be like Israel. And here's 4 things you need to keep in mind. So with that, let's go ahead and read the text. We'll look at how the last chapter ended, and then that'll toss us into the chapter we're looking at today. For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was, and this is interesting, the rock that they drank from, Old Testament Israelites, they drank from Christ. So keep that in mind. That'll be important later. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written. The people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 of them died. We should not test Christ, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, as some of them did, and they were killed by the destroying angel. These things happened to them as examples, and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is merciful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will provide a way out so that you can endure. I would highlight that. But when you are tempted, it does not say when you're tempted, you must sin. I don't think it says that. Brian, you know Greek pretty well. It doesn't say that in Greek either, does it? It says, but when you're tempted, he will provide a way out so that you can endure. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, Paul talks about the very real possibility that as we live our life for Christ, we can be disqualified from the prize of the gospel. And last week we said that doesn't mean in that chapter that he's saying you'll lose your eternal salvation. But what Paul is saying is, and this is a reality, not every believer who goes into heaven will hear the phrase, well done, good and faithful servant. That there are some who will barely get into heaven. As Paul says in chapter 3, you will get into heaven as one jumping through the fire. Or we might say, you got into heaven by the skin of your teeth. And Paul gets at the idea that as you and I live, we are given money, we are given resources, we are given time, we are given relationships. And our whole life is meant to be building God's kingdom. And at the end of our lives, everything we've accomplished will be in the presence of God. And God's consuming fire will destroy probably 98% of what we would call our life. Randy, your Prius is not going with you to heaven. I'm so sorry. My immaculate and beautiful board game collection, as much as I love it, is not going to heaven with me. Some of you have a collection of vintage t-shirts, probably. Your t-shirt collection is not going. And so Paul says, when you get to heaven, this life as you know it, this stuff's going to be burned away. And you don't want to show up to heaven and God says, what'd you do with your life? And you're like, well, I didn't spread the gospel. I can tell you that now because I'm scared. And Paul would say, that's a disqualification of all pride. Like, you've wasted your life. Like, you've chased after pursuits that were meaningless. And you have nothing to show for it. And Paul would say, look at these countless people I've led to Christ. Like, this is my legacy. And I can spend the rest of eternity with my legacy. Your board game legacy went up in flames. And so Paul continues that theme that, we need to have some serious conversations about consequences and warnings for believers. So in chapter 10, he says, let's talk about this this is beyond disqualification for prizes. We need to talk about the people of Israel and their experiences and their examples to us. And so notice how Paul talks about Israel. And this is interesting. And this might make us a little squishy. Paul says, first off, when the Israelites left Egypt, there was this pillar of cloud, and the cloud just kind of covered over them. And God's presence himself led them out of Egypt and guided them to the Red Sea. And the Red Sea splits open, and they pass through it. And notice what Paul calls it. He says, this was the Israelites' baptism. Isn't that fascinating? And we would say, but I also was baptized, just like the Israelites. And Paul would say, let's keep going. And he says, not only did God's presence lead them out and baptize them into the Red Sea, he saves them with a mighty hand, outstretched arm. He transforms their very identity. Prior to this Red Sea, if you were to say what describes the Israelites, you would say these are the slave people. But after they pass through this, their identity is completely changed. They're the people who belong to God, the people that God commits himself to, and the people that God saves with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Their very identity is no longer the same. And we would say, well, when we accept Christ, our identity also changes, and we become a new creation. And notice it says they're also baptized into Moses. And we might say, what the heck does that mean? Or if you're more conservative, you would say, what in the world does that mean? And if you're super conservative, you would say, But anyway, they're baptized into Moses. And does that sound weird to anyone? They were baptized in the name of Moses. That's odd. Well, what it gets at is the idea that for them, Moses is really the closest thing that they're going to have of Jesus until Jesus shows up. He's not Jesus. He's not divine. He's operating by God's power, but it gets at the idea that he is an example, a precursor to Christ, and he always points to Christ. Remember, he says, I'm going to die, but there's going to be the prophet who comes after me that you guys want to follow. And so to be baptized into Moses' name gets at the idea that they are identifying with Moses, that he is their appointed leader, he is their mediator, and they submit to his leadership, which you, I hope, laugh when you hear me say that because they don't really submit to it. But just like that, we know that Jesus is our God-appointed leader. He's our mediator to the Father, and we submit to him as our leader. And Moses also takes this group of people, and he is working to create a group of people with covenant loyalty to God only, just like Jesus is here to create a covenant community called the church that is loyal to God only. And so in many ways, they don't have Jesus like we do as we think of, but they have someone who operates kind of like that and points to Jesus. Paul also talks about, and this is fascinating, he says they also have spiritual food and spiritual drink. John Stott would say maybe a bad choice of translation. He would say it might be best to say they have supernatural food and supernatural drink, because we might think when he says spiritual food, that it's not real and physical. It's just like ethereal. It's like pretend food. But he would say this is physical stuff, but it's supernaturally provided. And notice what he says, and this is fascinating. I said, pay attention. We'll come back to this. He says this, they all ate the same spiritual food. They drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the same spiritual rock that accompanied them. And we might expect it to say this, and that rock was Yahweh. It was the Lord. It was God. But Paul doesn't say that. What does Paul say? He says the rock that the Israelites in the Old Testament drank from was Christ. And we should say, well, that's interesting. But what Paul would say is, even though Christ has not been revealed to them in the way that Jesus has been revealed to us, he's still the one sustaining them, even in the Old Testament. He's still the one who is the life, the living water, the light of the world. All those things that Jesus is, he is providing for them. They wouldn't think of it like that. But Paul says we can look back in retrospect and say the same Jesus that gives us life was also giving them life back then. You could argue, if you wanted to as well, that even this cloud leading and guiding and directing them is almost the foreshadow of the Holy Spirit, who also shows up like a mighty rushing wind to lead and to guide the church. And so Paul would say, let's not say the Israelites are too different than we are. Now, is it a perfect one-on-one equivalent? The answer is no. But for Paul, are they close enough that we can look at the Israelites and say, we can learn some powerful lessons from them? And Paul would say, yes, they're led by God's presence. They're baptized. They have a spiritual leader that they've been baptized into. They eat and drink from the presence of God himself. Paul would say specifically Christ. And they have been shown things and given experiences that are super powerful. Yet in verse 5, Paul says, but here's the reality. Even though they experienced all those things, they drank from Christ, they were baptized into the Red Sea and Moses, God's very presence led them. And verse 5, he says, nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. And so Paul says there's some pretty specific consequences to rebellion. And, this raises a lot of questions. We could say, well, what happens? Because to me, and maybe I'm wrong, but to me, if it seems like they're being led by God's presence, they're drinking of Christ, they're baptized by God, it seems to me that that almost describes that they've got some kind of relationship with the Lord. And I could be wrong, but that's what it seems like in this passage. And yet, rebellion plays at odds with that. And so Paul's asking us to consider something like, is it possible for a person to have a relationship with Christ and rebel against Christ? Like, is it possible to rebel against God and God bless your life and everything go fine, and then God's like, okay, I can overlook all your rebellion against me and no one's going to bat an eye? Paul says that's not how it works. Like, you can't have Jesus as king and rebel against him as king in the same breath. And so Paul says there's some very serious consequences to Israel because they've done this. And he says, here's three quick ones. One, he references the Exodus event. And you'll remember that the Israelites come out of Egypt. They pass through the Red Sea. They go to Mount Sinai. And God verbally gives them the Ten Commandments first. And after he verbally gives them the Ten Commandments, he invites Moses to come to Mount Sinai. And he says, now I'm going to physically give you copies of the Ten Commandments so that you can have them in writing. And while he's up there, the people only praise God and worship God and fast and pray. You guys remember that story? You don't, because it's not what happened. Moses goes up to get the physical copies of it. And it says, Paul quotes this. This is from Exodus chapter 32:6. The people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. If you don't know what that is, we do have a Bible scholar here today who will explain revelry to you. I don't want to. But anyway, long story short, the Israelites, while Moses is up there, like, we're pretty sure he's dead. So we need someone to lead us now. They go to Aaron, they take all their jewelry, and they say, make us a god. And Aaron's like, I guess, if you want me to. He makes him a god, and he says, behold, Israel, this is the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And they begin to worship worship this. They engage in sexual immorality. They do tons of horrible things. And Paul says, the consequence of this is that the Lord was very angry with them, and there was life that was lost because of this rebellion. He references a second story in verse 8. he talks about the day that 23,000 people died in Israel's history. For those of you who are like, what happened that day? If you go to Numbers chapter 23, 24, and 25, you'll be introduced to a king named Balak. And Balak has a Mesopotamian witch doctor from Mesopotamia come over. His name is Balaam. And Balak says, I want you to curse the people of Israel. And God says, I want you to bless them. So he blesses them. And he actually gives a very beautiful blessing that tells who God is, what he's done, and the future of God's people. And he's even got a reference to the Messiah tossed in there. It's like, Balaam's like awesome. Like, Balaam's going to lead them closer to Yahweh than anyone else has. And then you get to chapter 25, Balaam does hang out with them, but he introduces them to the first time in the Bible to the god Baal. And they begin to worship Baal, and they begin to engage in sexual immorality. And God calls the Levites, or God through Moses calls the Levites to declare judgment on them. And 23,000 people die that day because of the rebellion. And then the last story that Paul references is he talks about the time that they tested Christ and they were killed by snakes. If you don't know the story, God is leading them to the promised land. He's providing quail. He's providing manna. He's providing water. Everything they need, God has provided. And when God provides, are they always happy with it? They are never happy with it. And so they begin to complain. God, you just brought us out here because you just want to kill us all the time. And we keep wandering around because you're trying to find the perfect spot to kill us, you sicko. And so God sends these poisonous snakes that start biting them, and the people begin to die. And that's the story where they had to build the bronze serpent and look at it to be saved. And so Israel has a repeated history of just rebellion against God. Are these the only three stories? No. These are many of the same stories over and over again. And so notice in verse 6 and verse 11, Paul says, the reason we have all these Old Testament stories is because these are examples to who? Examples to us. It would be wrong to say, well, the Old Testament people were radically different than we are. And, and I would say, well, that is true. Like, they are radically different because, and think of it this way, for them, God's presence is above them and before them, leading them. But as Christians, where does God's presence reside? In us. When they are baptized by the Red Sea, do they actually go in the sea? The sea's off to the sides. When we're baptized into the water, and we're baptized into the Holy Spirit. So we are radically different because we should know better. We have God living in us. Like, we have the advantage. And Paul would say to the Corinthians, to us, we have it much better off being able to hear God's voice. So really, the only difference is we have less of an excuse than they did. And so Paul says, I need to give you 4 specific warnings that I want you guys to keep in mind. The first one is, just like the Israelites, verse 7, he says, I don't want you to be idolaters. Don't chase after other gods. Despite God providing for the Israelites over and over and over again, they always rejected God's provision, and they always chased after gods that never did anything for them. And they chased after the golden calves. They chased after Baal. As Randy's been leading us on Wednesday nights, they're chasing after Asherah, Molech. The list goes on and on. And we need to be careful that we don't chase after other gods as well. Now, the tricky thing with idolatry is when we think of idolatry, we might think of little statues, or we might think of gods like Ra and Baal and Chemosh and Molech and all these, and we would say we don't have any of those. And I could even, how many of you guys have an actual physical idol in your house? Does anyone have an idol in their bedroom? Raise your hand, pagan. One person in this church I know has an idol, and I said it's okay as long as you never worship it. But it's mixed with a bunch of little trinkets. But anyway, how many of you guys have an idol? How many of you guys don't have an idol at your house? And most of us would say we're safe. But the tricky thing with idolatry is it presents itself in different forms. And so we might even need to say, well, what exactly is idolatry? It is when you go to something else to save you, to define you, to be your top priority, to consume all your time, energy, and resources. And that could be anything. You could say, well, this takes all my time and my energy. And we could make a long list. And I could say, what do you guys think are big gods in our culture? And, you might say, how about phones? Anyone know how long the average person 11 years old and older is on their phone a day? It's more than 6 hours on average. It's about 8. The average person is on their phone about 8 hours throughout the day. Does anyone know how many times on average the average person will swipe their screen? It's between 2,000 and 3,000 times a day. And if you don't believe it, this is what I had the kids do. I was like, can you guys look on your phone and tell me how many hours you were on it? And it blew their mind. They said, there's no way this is possible. And I said, this is literally what you guys will spend most of your day doing. How many of you guys have seen adults do that? How many of you guys have done that yourself? That's why I've got a flip phone. It's a built-in safety net. Someone told me, Ron told me this week, he's like, Jeff, you need to get an Android. I said, I had an Android once upon a time. All I did was played Angry Birds and zombies ate my plants or whatever it is. I was like, I can't be trusted with one. So Paul would say, just watch out. Like sports, money, technology, cars, work, anything can become a god. So just be careful that we're not turning to things to define us that are not the Lord. Secondly, Paul says, I don't want you to be sex perverts. In verse 8, we should not commit sexual immorality as some of them did. We know that Israel constantly engaged in sexual immorality. Within the first 5 chapters of Genesis, Lamech is already doing sexually immoral things, and we just see that pattern throughout all of Scripture. And in Corinth, we've seen in chapter 5 that there's a case where a dude is in love with his stepmom. And Paul's like, you can't do this. Like, even the Corinthians hate that you do this. And Paul says we need to be careful because sexual immorality is everywhere. Whenever people say, I wonder what Paul would say to the Church of America, I always say, well, you already know. 1 Corinthians is probably the closest letter that I think Paul would write to us. It deals with a lot of things that we struggle with in our culture, a lot of the same themes. And we would say we live in a culture that is obsessed with pushing the boundaries of sexual immorality. Like what's okay to, or what's not okay today, just give it time, it will be okay. And so we just need to be careful in a culture that radically disagrees with the Bible's standards of sexual ethics. We need to be careful that we don't let the world's standard push into our standard and tell us how to live. Paul would remind us that our bodies are designed to be the temples of God. And God's temple, and Israel did this multiple times. Randy mentioned this, that they set up an Asherah pole right next to the Ark of the Covenant. In the story where we talk about where 23,000 people die, an Israelite takes a foreign lady into the tabernacle to have relations with her in front of the Ark of the Covenant. And, if you're not read the story, Phineas kills 2 people at one time. I'll let you read the story and figure out what's going on and how that happens. But, Paul would say we've got to be careful because sexual immorality is something that will always plague humanity. And the Bible stands at odds with what culture says. And if we're not careful, we'll get sucked into letting culture define how we define sexual ethics. Third and fourth, we'll put together, Paul says, do not test Christ and do not grumble. And you might say, why'd you put them together? Because when you read the context, they basically mean the same thing in those stories. Testing God in the Old Testament means when God provides something for you or God asks you to do something, you say no and you complain again about it. And interestingly, I had a young man named Jeffrey yesterday ask me this question. Dad, why doesn't God reveal himself in powerful ways anymore like he did in the Old Testament? And I said, good question. And I said, I think the reality is when you read the Bible, the more powerfully God shows up, the more people reject it, ironically. So, for example, Pharaoh in the book of Exodus has a front row seat to see how powerful God is. And at the end of the story, does Pharaoh say, you know what? I made a mistake. I was kind of stupid. I think Yahweh is the greatest God ever. Egyptians, let's worship Yahweh. Does that happen? No, in fact, Pharaoh says, I would rather kill every person in my country. I'd rather ruin all of our livestock, all of our crops. I would rather my own son die. I would rather be killed myself than have to do what Yahweh wants me to do. He has the most powerful display of God's character in the entire Old Testament, and he rejects it. Think about when Israel goes to Mount Sinai, and the mountain blows up in fire. There's a dark cloud. There's lightning. There's strange noises. There's trumpet sounds. There's earthquakes. And remember, after they hear God speak the 10 Commandments, Israel says, man, we love this. We want to hear this every day. They don't say that, do they? Remember what they say? I think it's one of the saddest lines in all of Scripture. We never want to hear God's voice again. You guys remember that verse? That's one of the saddest lines. Like, everything has been leading up to Mount Sinai. It's like you take your family on vacation, you drive across the whole United States, and you finally get there and your kids are like, you know what? This vacation sucks. We hate this place, and we hate you. Like, that's it. Like, Sinai was meant to be this awesome experience, and what did they say? We'd prefer never to hear God speak again, Moses. And then maybe the biggest incarnation that we have of God showing up is Jesus himself. This is the most powerful display of God's power. God himself humbles himself, takes the very nature of a human, dies. That's a spoiler. I wasn't supposed to say that. Takes the form of a human, ministers to people, humbles himself repeatedly. And how does humanity respond to this revelation? They kill him. And so we see this theme that the more powerfully God shows up for people, the more people reject God's movement. It's fascinating. And we might even know churches. We might even know Christians who do this. So when the God says, I clearly want you to do this, is the response typically awesome, or is it typically, God, it sounds like you're trying to do something new. We've never done it that way before. We're done. And we probably all know people that when God challenges them to step out of their comfort zone, their typical response, unfortunately, is no. And so Paul would say, don't test God. When God asks you to do something, you need to do what God asks you to do. You don't need to ask questions. You just say, God, I trust you to lead me in the future. And so Paul closes this out by saying,